Welcome to Understanding the Business Environment. Today we're lucky to have with us Rebecca Valenzuela, who is a Principal Economist and Research Manager at the Department of Treasury and Finance in the Victorian government. So, hi Rebecca, welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. I know you're very busy, so as research manager, and I want to ask you a little bit about being a research manager because a lot of our students would probably think of going in that direction. But before that, I wanted to focus a little bit on sort of understanding the macroeconomy. And we had a coffee before, and we were chatting at first about how we both really like macro when we started university, and then we became micro focused. So I just want to, as someone who works in the government, I thought, you'd have a lot of insights as to why understanding macroeconomics is important, and in particular, how economists in government sort of understand the macroeconomy in order to advise policymakers more broadly. So could you walk us a little bit through that process, if that's okay?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. I find myself very fortunate to be applying my economic skills in the government because in the Department of Treasury and Finance, we manage the resources for the Victorian state. And in economics, it's really trying to allocate. The problem is allocating this vast resources on an infinite number of needs for the economy. So there's a lot of competing needs, and we in the Treasury kind of have make the decisions on where these resources go to maximize growth and opportunities for everybody. And so we are one of the things that we are want to be good in and deliberately inform ourselves with is the goings on of how the firms behave and how households respond to policy. And also we look at the global environment because that sets the framework for all the policies that we try to fund and implement. And economics is a very important element in all the policy advice that we provide the ministers. And it has, we go from specific look at data, which abound in this day and age, so micro data, macro data. We look at models that help us understand relationships between variables and all these levers that the government, trying to find out which levers we pull so that the impact or the outcomes that we want in the labor market or the business environment and will be, and the impact on individuals and groups, how can we maximize or improve welfare within the state, and how we are affected by events in other states and in the global environment as well.
Great, thank you. That is a really, really interesting job, and I think a lot of students would be interested in finding out a little bit more about that. I just want to step back. You mentioned sort of growth before in sort of one of the key goals of sort of policy, and how do you allocate your expenditure in that case? So for those people at home, of course, when we look at aggregate demand, we're looking at consumption, investment, government expenditure, which is basically exports minus imports, right? So everybody at home would have come across this. But the idea here is when you push that lever, that G, the government expenditure, you spoke a little bit about growth. So when we're looking at government expenditure and how we can increase growth, say, where we allocate investment in order for us, and I don't mean investment as I mean investment as G in this case, so government expenditure, so that the economy does a little bit better, so that there's more job opportunities, so that we grow. That sounds like a tricky thing. So how I guess my question is, when it comes to understanding what levers to pull, what role does basic understanding of the economy play, and how much does that inform the types of models and the type of modeling that you end up doing in practice?
I think fundamental to all these decisions is trying to define your aims as an economy. What do you want for the economy? What do you want for the constituents that you serve? And so as public servants, sometimes this is implicit, but sometimes, many times, and I think most times, to the teams that I work with, and these need to be clear. So what are we trying to do? What is the fundamental aim for the whole of the economy? How to break this down, this aim, into smaller aims, and how our particular work fit into this whole narrative and this whole story. And so that is important in trying to map out a strategy, so that that feeds into this overall aim.
Right.
And the state government machinery is humongous. It's big, and it's responsible for a whole set of complex things. And so this definition of roles, for example, in education and justice, in social welfare and taxes, these need to be clarified so that it all fit together neatly in this framework. And so that is a fundamental thing that we need to every now and then remind ourselves. And also, goals change over time, depending on the conditions in the environment. So during COVID times, we really had to assess what is most important, and that's of course the health of the economy, and that kind of the health of the economy, the health of the individuals, and that then dictated the kinds of actions that followed to support this broader goal. And there's also tricky thing about policymaking is that you got to balance. In economics, we do trade-offs. We do a lot of trade-offs, and to me, I say that as you gotta have a good balance between achieving short-term goals and your long-term aims for the economy. So things like climate change affect us and affect our policies going into 2030, zero emissions. That's long-term goal beyond terms of ministers. But we also look at the current cost of living pressures that individuals and families face to this day. So when we think about allocating resources, we have this bunch of money that we collect from taxes, and we need to remind ourselves of the goals that, in the short term, what are the levers that can impact on the short-term outcomes, and how this impact in the long term as well. So and the other things that we need to remember is that a lot of the things that when government intervenes, for instance, we need to know the area very well, because, for example, we have interventions in education that return a lot of positive externalities to the economy and to people in the economy. So when we invest in education on one person, then that person becomes have a finer way of thinking, can participate more in the economy, can find a way of thinking, can participate more in the economy, and can vote more wisely about choices. And if we have more and more people being wise voters, then we have a bit more participation and direction in the way that we want to drive the economy as a whole in terms of people.
Well, that's really interesting. I really like the idea of understanding sort of government policy sort of under the light of sort of politics and voting, because these things are heavily interlinked in the sense that society decides, as you rightly said, which direction we should be going, what goals are most important for us. And in the public sector, you're saying your job is basically to see what those goals are and find the right levers to achieve those goals, which I think is quite nice. Mentioning education, of course, is important. We know education drives growth. Educated people are more likely to be entrepreneurial, to open jobs, to create employment for others. So there is this sort of, as you said, positive externalities, and we do some work on positive externalities in this course as well. In that regard, though, a lot of what you know and a lot of what you guys work on in Treasury and finance is really driven by what we know from research. And you work in the research office. You're the manager of the research department. So how does how do you interlink with researchers? I find in I guess my perspective as a researcher at a university is that in economics we tend to work more closely with government and industry and university than in a lot of other disciplines. So how valuable is that research that is generated out of universities for you, for your job, and how integrated do you feel your department is to this type of research?
So I come from an academic background, so I have full appreciation for the power of research to inform decision makers. And in the Treasury, in the Department of Treasury and Finance, my job is to create an environment where those who are inclined to research can, and we have a senior leadership group that is fully appreciative of the fact that any policy advice that we deliver to ministers need to be backed up by research. It has to be grounded in theory and strong application experience, but also it needs to be data-driven, evidence-based, and that we make sure that this data, the wealth of data that we have, are fully and rigorously analyzed so that we can develop the best policy advice or tax reform advice or policies to increase, for example, the take-up of electronic vehicles so that we can meet the 2030 zero emissions target. Mm-hmm. So research is very fundamental to our job of policy development and advice. And we, in the space that I work in the revenue group, we do a lot of forecasting. We collect a lot of data from the state revenue office. We advise ministers or senior executives on how our economy has done in the recent past and how it is going in the future. And so we can look at things like inflation rates, how's that tracking, labor market trends, vacancies and employment rates. For example, also like the gender balance in the employment rates, how all that is tracking over time, how we respond to crisis, and how we evaluate we provide opportunities or tools so that we can more accurately assess how our policies have impacted, or has it achieved its aims given the situation, say in COVID times, and so those bits of research are important. We collaborate a lot because no one really has knowledge of everything, and so we have technical people in the department. We have a lot of people that work with data. We write codes, we do scripts, we do modeling of time series data, we forecast consumption, we explore statistical tools and explore power of data, and we collaborate with universities including funding for health projects, analyzing inequality using tax data from the ABS. And so research is very, very powerful. In fact, there's so much you can research about. And so I find sometimes it's very overwhelming. So then it's again a problem of allocation of resources. So you have to prioritize what to research on given the needs of the policymakers. And again, what is the aim of the economy growth and all that? So we feed research into those aims as well.
That's really interesting. But it's amazing because you mentioned a lot of the work you do is environment.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned poverty. You mentioned inequality, including the gender inequality. Health.
Yes.
And you're right. The breadth of research that we can do in economics to inform society can be incredibly broad. But you also mentioned data, and I find that to be the common denominator. In my experience, understanding data analysis, especially causal inferences, and our students will be doing one lecture on causal inferences and have opportunities for more down the line. But I find that sort of does lead to B sort of testing to be really important in business and in policy generally. So when you guys are looking for hiring a new person, say a grad, does their ability to handle data play a strong role in your choice of this person? Or do you look even more broadly to see what other attributes there are? In other words, what would the perfect grad, I guess, look to you in if you take this question also as a way of advising future students, what path to take if they wish to work in your department?
So DTF is composed of several units. My unit in particular is very technical and data-driven, and we do a lot of modeling and forecasting. And there's other areas in DTF where there's not much on modeling, but they do detailed policy analysis, and they develop policy advice. I think that's, I correct myself, that's also data-driven now. So we have grads that go into that area as well. We have also grads, so grads rotate, so they can have this wealth of experience across the different fields of areas of DTF. Then there's also an area in DTF where we need people who can communicate, because on the one hand, our technical work will be meaningless if we can't break that down into simple terms or terms that can be understood by a very busy secretary or treasurer. And so we need to be able to say this is the numbers that we expect to get in next year, and this is where we're headed in 5 years' time. We know that those forecasts, for instance, we need to be able to assure them that it is strongly that it's reliable, and so it's backed up by research. And so we need people who can who have this technical work in data and modeling, but at the same time we need people who also can communicate this very accurately and very ably. We have a unit in DTF that this communication work, we work with intergovernment agencies, particularly the federal government in the area of GST, goods and services tax, because they give us revenues from that goods and services tax, which first goes on to the Commonwealth, and then that's divided across the states. So we always have this advocacy business where we ensure that the formulas for distributing this revenues from the GST are fair to Victoria, are fair, follow the principles of equalization, and that it also adjusts to the times that to the current situation of the times, and then we make them aware of the concerns of the state with regard to their national concern. So we need a lot of, for the grads, we need people who are technology savvy. We need people who can write codes. We need people who can strong in methods. That's all good, but we also need people who can write. We write budgets. We develop these 5 chapters in the budget papers, and there's always opportunities to the journalists, for instance, will look at this in detail, and we should be able to communicate the goals for that deliverable in very clear ways. And then the other thing is that, of course, we have to be able to evaluate budget bids, like people from different departments make proposals to us and make budgets, propose budgets to fund them. So we have this very busy time around this time where we look at all these budget bids. It's always that the total amount that's being asked for is always bigger than what we have. So we need to be able to have the skills to assess these budget bids, whether we select programs, which programs to fund, and whether we provide full funding or partial funding. And what determines that is really going back to the aims. What are the goals? What are we trying to achieve? And that sort of is the guiding principle.
And that's really interesting. And like how it links back to the core goals
Yes.
of the sort of your core social goals, if
Yep.
you will. Well, you'll be happy to know as well that in our current course and throughout the degree, we do a lot of work on communication. So students are encouraged to do presentations and really try to explain some of these concepts like marginal cost to a non-technical audience. I also think that that's really crucial. So a good economist is an economist that is well understood.
Yes, that's right.
So that I think it's very important both in government and in policy as well. But Rebecca, thank you very, very much for your time. I think you've answered all my questions, and I know you're in a very busy time. So thank you very, very much again. And I'm sure our students will be very excited by this video, and hopefully you'll be getting a few grads from RMIT knocking on your door in a few years' time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and please look at DTF as a destination for when you're looking for challenge and excitement in the economic space of the labor market. Thank you.